Welcome to this week's edition of the Monocle Banking Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Michael Avery, and thank you very much to Monocle for being behind these fantastic conversations we get to have with the industry leaders, investors, and change makers who are changing South Africa for the better. Well, South Africa finds itself at a critical juncture where infrastructure development is no longer just a policy goal, but it's an absolute national imperative just to enable the broader economy to continue to operate, from energy, which is starting to turn the corner, to more importantly, logistics, Transnet, ports and rail, water infrastructure, and more importantly as well, housing, social housing, student accommodation, and hospitals and clinics. There really is huge opportunity and scope across the board for strategic investments that deliver both economic returns but social impact as well. And I think it's never been more pressing. Very encouragingly, we heard from Minister Dean McPherson that government is doubling down on supporting a project preparation with more funds, and that really is a big gap. Well, today we're joined by two exceptional thought leaders who are actively shaping the future of infrastructure investments in the country. First, we've got Prudence Mogolola, an investment officer with the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC. Prudence brings a wealth of experience in project finance, particularly across logistics, water, energy, and tech. And alongside her, we have Ashley Daswa, who's a senior investment specialist at Sanlam Corporate Investments. Ashley recently rejoined, bringing with him extensive experience from his roles at Old Mutual, as well as Impact Amplifier. And his expertise span finance, investments, and impact investing. So in today's discussion, we're going to explore some of the challenges, but importantly, some of the opportunities in accelerating infrastructure investments and assessing the role of public-private partnerships under the Government of National Unity. Let's jump right in and begin the conversation. Ashley, Prudence, thank you so much for both being here. Prudence, maybe you could just kick us off. How would you define, because we often throw the term around without fully understanding what we mean, how would you define impact investing and infrastructure investment in the South African context?
Thank you, Michael, for having me in this very important discussion. I mean, if I look at the development finance institution that IDC is, when we talk of impact investment, that is the core of what we do. Our mandate is essentially to build industrial capacity of the country. So we do that by focusing on sectors and value chains that offer the greatest potential to unlock job opportunities that enable transformation and that demonstrate benefits to society and the environment, while also ensuring that we also have regional integration. So when I think of impact investing, in summary, it's actually using our funds not only to achieve financial returns, but to do good. So that's in essence what a development finance institution does, is we look at aspects of society, we look at where the gaps are, and we try and come in and mitigate the risks or provide solutions that can help ensure that we have economic development, and not only economic development, but we ensure that there's societal benefit in the work that we do. If I look at the priority sectors and value chains that we focus on, we look at industry holistically. So we have chemicals, we have automotive sector, we have the agricultural sector, we have mining sectors that we look at. We're also now looking at emerging sectors like the new energy vehicle sector. We're looking at hydrogen, to name some of the few projects that we are focusing on, or the businesses that we support. So when you look at infrastructure investment, or from our perspective, we're looking at how do we support infrastructure that enables operations and the functioning of these businesses. So, for example, our focus areas is energy, water, logistics, and telecoms, as you correctly alluded to them. And the reason we focus on those sectors, they are an enabler for the industries that are a priority for us. So that's how we look at infrastructure investment. Our focus is on industrial infrastructure because it then enables these industries that we are looking to create jobs, to ensure this transformation, and to ensure that there's benefit to society. I hope that sums it up well.
Prudence, that really does, I think, very neatly encapsulate what the IDC does. And very important for this conversation to understand that the mandate of the IDC is to support industrialization. So we're not really talking about some of the water challenges, for example, that we experience at a local government level. To bring you in on this point, Ash, I mean, how would you define it, and what makes these approaches pivotal for South Africa's future growth?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and good evening to your listeners. From our perspective, when we talk about infrastructure investment, to a greater extent, it really involves allocation of capital, and this capital could come from institutional investors such as your pension funds, it could come from family offices, sovereign wealth funds, come from university endowments, and to a greater extent, the capital is really meant to develop, to maintain, and also to operate some of these essential infrastructures facilities that really support economic activity. So look at sectors like, your economic infrastructure, like your transport, roads, bridges, airports, etc. Got energy, which is power plants, electricity grids, and water supply, as you just mentioned, telecommunication. And of course, there's the social infrastructure, which is your schools and your public housing. And really to define it to say, for the greater benefit of, a better working South Africa, when we allocate capital into infrastructure investments, you actually earn long-term investment returns because these are really critical for the functioning of the society. If you really come to think of the multiplier effect in which investment into social infrastructure can then contribute to, the workers' productivity, can contribute to other methods of infrastructure like your transport and your energy. And on the one hand, we have got, this whole concept of impact investing, which to a greater extent is really there to have a specific impact up, right? You all appreciate the fact that, you've got traditional investments and then you've got thematic investments where you want to achieve a specific themes. But when it comes to impact, it's really generating both the financial returns, which most investors are interested in, but equally so also addressing some of the social return, notably things like addressing challenges relating to poverty, inequality, climate change. And these are issues that, South Africa and the world in its entirety, they are actually confronted with. And I would say there's loads of capital that has been flowing into these investments, but there's still more scope for us to actually contribute to a better working South Africa through investments into infrastructure alongside impact investing.
Just on that point, Ashley, given your background and your recent return to Sanlam now, what shifts have you noticed in how institutional investors are approaching infrastructure investments? And we bumped into each other at the Big Pension Funds Conference, Africa, the RFA, in Cape Town recently, and it did seem that institutional capital allocators, pension funds, trustees, principal officers, and their asset consultants are very aware of the need, but maybe are not sure exactly of the opportunity and maybe might be a little bit concerned about things surrounding liquidity, for example. What do you see in terms of the appetite?
Yeah, indeed, Mike. There is quite a substantial amount of appetite because these are allocators of capital and asset owners that increasingly they want to see investments returned such that one day they retire comfortably. But they don't want to retire comfortably in environments which there is no proper running water and sanitation. There's no right infrastructure in terms of roads, in terms of schools, etc. And they want to invest. They want their money and the monies of the members whom they are the stewards on their behalf to be invested into projects that really are tangible. So you mentioned when we were met at the IRFA conference, the general conversation within the room was about when we took the whole concept of sustainability, how do we then invest into real assets that really then contribute to the job creation, address inequality, but also ensure that these members are actually retiring comfortably. But this is not a South African conversation. It's a conversation that we've seen that even global players in the markets in the global north, they are focusing on ESG integration. They are recognizing that infrastructure investments, it doesn't just offer financial return, but it also offers this long-term societal impact. And this really mirrors some of these socio-economic goals that are happening in the global south. And if you really bring it, closer to home, one of the things that we've engaged with, these allocators of capital from the conference and other forums has been issues relating to liquidity. And we've really encouraged the allocators of capital to say, you've got to look at your asset allocation. When you're slicing and dicing your 110 or billion rand portfolio, you should be mindful of the fact that as you invest into private markets like infrastructure, impact investing, and the like, there's the illiquidity premium that you earn, but also you cannot just wake up tomorrow and say, we want to disinvest or we want to fire Michael and co and we allocate it to somebody else. There is also that liquidity constraints, and they have to be mindful of the fact that when you invest into projects such as infrastructure, you're there for a long haul. Roads and tolls are there for many years. When you're investing into housing, when investing into healthcare, when investing into student housing, as an example. You are there for a long haul. And if you really want to move your assets, you should be at least have sufficient time to wait for the disinvestment to happen. And this has been one of the sort of a golden thread in the conversation we've had at the conference, where the general mood was that, yes, we want to allocate our investments into private markets, particularly infrastructure and impact investing, but we should also be mindful of the liquidity aspect.
Yeah, I think one has to. And that's often why I think pension funds are so well suited to this, because, they have long-term liabilities and they're well matched in terms of the long lead time and the payout profiles of infrastructure projects as well, that can give you that predictability and certainty over a 10, 15, 20-year build, own, operate kind of life cycle. Prudence, I want to bring you back in on this idea of, the public-private partnership model. There's been a real focus on this since the Government of National Unity. There's understanding that we've got to be able to do it together, because no one party can solve such a big challenge, such as funding all of these infrastructure needs. Where do you see the gaps in financing infrastructure, and how is the IDC navigating these challenges?
So I think this has been discussed widely, and I think there was even a publication yesterday which came through from the Infrastructure South Africa about the challenge that we face with finding bankable transactions. So I think what it looks like now is you obviously have funds available from the pension funds, you have your DFIs also available. But the big gap that we've seen all along is the availability of getting projects to a bankable stage.
Yeah.
In as much as there is a big gap as far as infrastructure upgrades that are required, getting those projects to a stage where a funder like ourselves can actually get involved and fund these transactions is the big challenge, and not just in South Africa, but even in the rest of the continent. So how we are looking at this, IDC has a project development unit that assists clients with scoping of projects and bringing these projects to bankability. We also then have a syndication unit that once the project has reached bankability stage, we try to crowd in other funders to then help to support the projects. But my sense is that this is still not sufficient. I know that DBSA also has a project preparation unit. Then we have also Infrastructure South Africa that's also looking at developing projects. But I think really a lot more funding is required. And the type of funding that's also required is important. So whilst most might provide debt funding, in this case, you need a lot more patient capital. So to allow for the development of the projects, because project development is risky. So you need capital that would allow for the development of these projects. I think that's where the major gap is. We have funds that we can apply to infrastructure projects, but how do we get these projects ready?
What does bankable look like? I mean, what do you assess as an investor? Are you looking at the reliability and predictability of a project's cash flows? Are you looking at the security of long-term contracts or offtake agreements? What makes a project ideally bankable?
It's all those factors. So it's about looking at the cash flows, as you mentioned. We look at various aspects in our due diligence processes. So we have a reliable off-taker. For example, once this project is developed, where are the revenues going to be generated from? Where are the cash flows coming from? In terms of, establishing or building the project, do we have the technical capability to manage, design, operate the infrastructure? And then we look at also the social benefits, as I mentioned. Is this project going to create jobs for society? What will be the societal impact of the project? We would also look at the environmental impact of the project to see if there are any adverse risks that we need to be aware of, that we need to mitigate against. So it's all of those factors that one would look at, so that by the time the project is at a stage where you can present to your credit committee, then all these sort of considerations have been factored in. Where there are risks, we have found ways to mitigate those risks. So that's generally what we mean by bankability.
Ashley, to bring you in on that point, to add to that, you probably got the regulatory and legal risks, and there's questions about the project financing and capital structure of a particular transaction and whether or not it makes sense. How do you, as Sanlam, evaluate all of those risks and then also overlay this idea of impact on top of it? And how do you weight each? I mean, what is more important? That first and foremost, if it meets all the financial criteria, then maybe you look at some of the non-financial criteria.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think on this whole conversation around public-private partnership, just as much as the scope for us to do more, I think we need to appreciate the fact that we have made some successful strides in SA. If you look at the RIP projects that are now part of the grid, if you look at the toll road concession, I mean, the Gautrain as an example has been one of those, rapid link that has been, quite successful. Of late, we have seen the border post, and as Prudence mentioned, the work that Infrastructure South Africa and the like on the Operation Vulindlela, those are some of the progress that I think we have made. And to a greater extent, I think, we should appreciate where we have come and to an extent where we are right now. Yes, there's still a gap, Mike. If you look at the public-private sector capital as a percentage of the GDP from 94 to almost 2023, 22, it's still way below the 30%, which is the NDP target. And that really then begs the question, where are the bottlenecks? And as you mentioned, there's still issues relating to regulatory uncertainties. Things like Regulation 28. It was put in place in February 2022 in terms of almost 45% investment into infrastructure, but it still begs the question, what do we mean by infrastructure? Because infrastructure could be the IDC alongside Sanlam and other investors investing into a water project or whatever kind of project, but investment into MTN, as an example, could still be deemed to be an infrastructure. Equally so, I think we have looked into things like your execution delay. And this really deals with some of these socio-economic issues we've been faced with, the extortions, the construction mafias and the likes. And to your question in terms of how do we really mitigate this risk, on our end, it has been about how do we engage some of the government bodies. To the conference you made mention of, we were in the room alongside, the likes of your FSCA to ensure that, these are guys that are there to provide guidance in terms of providing regulatory reforms. The likes of the National Treasury, they are there to provide that guidance in terms of how do we align our projects with, the national priorities in terms of infrastructure South Africa. Also, I think on our end, one of the things that we've really been very intentional about when it comes to sort of trying to demystify this risk has been identifying the right partners. So we've got one of our newly launched fund, the Property Impact Fund, which is going to invest into healthcare, student housing, low-income housing, and the like. And one of the things that we have realized is that, the lessons we have learned, even some of the managers that have been there, that have been in this space, it's, how do you then identify the right operators? How do you then identify the right construction companies? How do you then make sure that you're working with the right contractors that can make sure that you don't have these execution delays? And to answer your question, Mike, I think it really comes down to say, how do you create this robust partnership to ensure that there's long-term project success?
Actually, on that point, I was chatting to someone from Growth Point Investment Partners recently about their fund. I think they raised about 3 billion into student accommodation, purpose-built student housing, I think they call it. And, it was premised on a model that NSFAS would allow students a certain capped spend on accommodation, and then unilaterally that was changed without consultation within the broader industry. And that obviously impacts the modeling around these projects and the financial returns. And so it was a dent to confidence. It wasn't a deal breaker. But increasingly, we really need to see, if we're going to have public-private partnerships, just greater collaboration and communication between the public and the private sector before decisions like that are taken.
Yeah, agreed, Mike. I think by no means the same issue you are alluding to. It is actually one of the issues that one of the providers of an impact fund have actually experienced a decline in their returns as a result of that, they factored that they're going to have X number of students in their student accommodation, and suddenly that changes. And I think these are some of the things which, requires both collaborative efforts between, business, private sector and government to ensure that we don't find ourselves, moving backwards in these types of reforms.
Prudence, to bring you back in, and the National Development Plan, which is still our lodestar, envisions greater infrastructure spending. I know Miriam Altman was one of the co-authors of our National Infrastructure Plan all the way out to 2050. We've had strategic infrastructure symposiums, strategic infrastructure projects named, but it still feels like we talk about this, yet we're not seeing the kind of progress. The REAP program stands out, absolutely. If you look at what's going on at Baitbridge, absolutely. But we need to see so much more. What would you like to see happen to speed up the urgency with which we need to address the various infrastructure bottlenecks in this country? Is it something that could be done by changing legislation somewhere? Is it maybe more effort in project preparation, to your earlier point? Do we need to see more secondment of skills into that space? From where you sit, what would help speed up infrastructure rollout?
Yeah, so I think it's what I mentioned previously. We almost need more incentives or more investment towards project development. I think that has always been or seems to be generally the big constraint to us realizing these plans that we are putting into place. There is a list at the moment of a lot of projects that have been earmarked for development, but again, without the capability and the financing that is needed to go towards the development of the project, we will always be in the same position. The other aspect is, there is the revised PPP framework that, from what I understand, has provided some relaxation to sort of reduce the red tape that was, inhibiting the performance of these PPPs. I think we're looking forward to seeing how the rollout of this new framework will assist in terms of bringing projects to the fore. One of the amendments that I noted is the fact that they're looking at exempting projects below 2 billion from the National Treasury approval requirements. So I think actions like that would actually help in allowing for fast tracking of these projects and bringing them more to delivery.
Ashley, from your perspective, I know the minister yesterday, when announcing this special project preparation fund, which is most welcome, also used it as an opportunity to say, maybe we've got to look at our procurement regulations and the fact that we've got this so-called 30% set aside being a gateway for the construction mafia. Is this something that you think we need to relook at? I'm all for using infrastructure spend to help transform the South African economy, but the way it's being done now seems to have been hijacked by the various business fora that are plaguing construction sites across the country.
Yes, indeed, Mike. I think, yes, the announcement yesterday was quite encouraging to see that coming through. But one would then say, look, things like Operation Vulindlela, it has provided that model of removing bottlenecks to enabling this faster project execution in sectors such as energy and water. But I believe that there should be more to really mitigate this, risk that is associated with this construction mafias and, crippling this public-private partnership. Because ideally, the intention is to really turn South Africa to be a construction site where we're seeing more investments into infrastructure so that we can create these sustainable jobs. But if there are still these bottlenecks, I think to a greater extent, that sort of take us almost steps backwards.
I want to end off on a high note. So, Prudence, you said before we started this conversation that you're really busy. You got lots of transactions that haven't been closed yet. So that's encouraging to hear. What excites you about South Africa and our infrastructure program and project today? Where are the areas that you think are going to be the most boldly transformative over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think for me is we are realizing more and more that we need to partner, public and private, to deliver these projects. So what's exciting now is, there is the freight roadmap that was approved by Cabinet at the end of last year. So which is now allowing, for example, the private sector to participate in sort of alleviating the operational inefficiencies that we've seen with Transnet and helping to unlock the bottlenecks that have been seen with Transnet. So for me, that is exciting because we will then be seeing a lot of private sector participants coming to look for funding so that we can unlock the bottlenecks that the industry has experienced as far as Transnet is concerned. So that's one aspect of it. I'm also excited about the opportunities that we're looking at in terms of transmission grids. So we already know that we're building up the skills around generation capacity. And now it's about saying, how do we build up the transmission capacity? So that for me is also an area that is exciting. And again, it will take us partnering with the private sector to realize these project. Obviously, what we embrace about the private sector is the efficiency which the private sector brings, the innovative solutions that they bring. And I think together with ourselves, we will be able to address some of these infrastructure gaps.
Well, that is hugely encouraging, and it certainly builds on what the Deputy President was quoted as saying by the FT in London last week as well, saying that we really need to get away from the old isms in South African society and realise that it's only by working together that we can solve some of these intractable challenges. Thank you very much, Prudence Mogolola from the IDC and Ashley Daswa from Sanlam Corporate Investments. Great insights into impact-driven infrastructure development here on the Monocle Banking Podcast. Thank you to our audience for being part of another critical conversation. Let's just continue to push for investments that not only build the economy, but also build a better future for all South Africans. Until next time, I'm Michael Avery. Stay tuned to the Monocle Banking Podcast next week for more engaging discussions that drive South Africa forward.